very much for that introduction. And I'm very, very honored to be here, very honored, and great idea. I think church connection grant to bring together social workers, my God. I don't know what Woody Allen would say, but social workers. I should just preface this by saying that the abstract that I sent in, I now realize, I mean, I will be touching on elements of what I said in my abstract, but it's probably not actually what I got into. Once I was a bit more free-flowing with this paper. I sort of didn't come at it in a sort of normal kind of way in which I was going to kind of really narrow in on an argument. So I wanted actually to kind of lay out a playing field in some ways, about where I think social workers come from, sort of a little bit about where we're at. And in a general way, what I'll be talking about is the kind of ideas and philosophy and ideology and everything that the settler society brought with them into Canada. This is the liberal thinking. So if I'm not talking directly to Indigenous issues, you have to lift it out and think, this is the mindset that we brought and began to apply and administer through our policies for Indigenous peoples. So I'm going to actually reflect a little bit. I don't want to take too much time. Well, I'll take as much time as I want. I begin this paper with some personal, non-academic, and well, perhaps quasi-academic reflection on what drew me to social work, and why I'm not so sure. I might qualify this statement a bit. I'm not sure I'd be totally drawn to social work today, but I think I probably would be. But I guess with some qualifiers. I grew up in a somewhat middle-class neighborhood of Ottawa. I say somewhat because our tiny subdivision abutted the remains of an older, sort of semi-rural, impoverished community, as well as a new low-income housing project called Moortown Housing, which I found, I Googled it the other day, and found it actually still exists. It sort of is there, and it still is run by the sort of Housing Corporation of Ottawa, and it's still very vibrant sort of access for low-income housing in Ottawa. And I think it's probably obviously named after some sort of benevolent civic denizen, you know. But anyway, and sort of to the north of us lay a large CNHC housing project built as part of post-war reconstruction, and which we affectionately knew as the VETS, because the homes had been built entirely for the purpose of housing returning World War II veterans. And in the heart of this community was my public elementary school, which was, I can only describe as a huge, sprawling factory of education for about 1,500 children. And then nearby was a large but somewhat smaller English-speaking Roman Catholic school. And further off to the west, on the other side of a road that seemed like a dividing line, was a Roman Catholic French-speaking school. And this was our local area, and it's Ottawa's version of Two Solitudes. So by today's standards, the community in my school were not visibly diverse, but there was diversity, obviously. There were the French and the English, there were Catholics, Protestants, Anglicans, Ukrainian Orthodox, and Jews, some of whom were children of the Holocaust. And there were Poles and Germans, Italians, Hungarians, Irish, Scots, Welsh, and English, smatterings of other European origins, as well as a few Chinese. There was also economic diversity. And at school, the poor kids, it seemed to me, always got the short end of the stick. For reasons I didn't understand at the time, but whose behavior and language in the eyes of authority were clearly problematic. And so getting to school was sometimes a challenge. I was small for my age, surprise, surprise. And I walked through a sort of a tougher part of the neighborhood. And I always remember that scene in that film, Christmas Story. You'll shoot your eye out.
Yeah, you're going to take your eye out.
Yeah, and he's always getting beaten up by the bullies on the way to school. So that was sort of partly my experience on running the gauntlet to school. Indigenous peoples were nowhere present, except in museum dioramas, despite the fact that Ottawa had many First Nations communities nearby, and that the city existed and continues to exist on unceded Algonquin territory. We were taught, isn't that a supreme irony, the capital of Canada sitting on unceded territory, and they're going to pay for it very dearly. We were taught, of course, that First Nations peoples were relics of our early history, but that whatever remained of them were being well cared for by the Department of Indian Affairs, and Father knows best. So that was the sort of. So why do I bring all this up? Because in retrospect, the neighborhood was formative to my sensibilities and understanding that Canadian society was not all it was cracked up to be. Pockets of poverty and disadvantage threaded their way through nearly all ethnic and religious groups, but were mainly evident among the French and the Irish who constituted Ottawa's working class. The sanitized 50s were actually rife with marital discord, affairs, and domestic violence. I remember puzzling over our next-door neighbor's kicked-in front door. Another neighbor, ostensibly on a household errand to pick up a loaf of bread, was located next day in a Manhattan bar. And when I went to university, I studied sociology. At that time, just before the Vietnam War became full-blown, the world of white middle-class America seemed to dominate the texts as a measure of normality. Sociology struck me as a sterile, sort of lifeless discipline, pretending to objective neutrality, when in fact the world outside seemed to scream for someone to state a position on its many ills. Ironically, it was through a course in child psychology in which we were required to engage in some form of volunteer work with children, not be so easily required these days. There was some endless police checks before we'd be able to do that in the class. But I really encountered poverty and dispossession. I chose to work in a pilot project operated by the Family Service Centre of Ottawa called the After 4 Project, an outreach program fashioned after those that were being pioneered in the US at the time as part of its war on poverty. And this volunteer experience soon transformed into part-time, then full-time employment. And for a while I dropped out of university. For 1 year I also went to live in the East End of London and worked in a settlement house. This was the old Jewish part of the East End, but its demographic was already rapidly changing, and as the Jewish population moved to North London, it was replaced by new immigrants from the Caribbean and South Asia, both sites of former British colonial rule. Settlement House celebrated their diversity, as did my Ottawa program, but what underlay much of the work was the issue of poverty. That was the universal oppressor, or at least it was the form of oppression that only capitalism could best produce. When I returned to Ottawa, I again worked at the After 4 Project and resumed my studies in Carleton. Courses were now available that reflected changing approaches to sociology. Marxist theories were introduced. Courses on community, labor relations, social policy, urban theory, ethnicity, and so on were suddenly there for the taking. And so I was able to couple newly acquired knowledge and a beginning ability to press an analysis on a social problem with my passion for the form of social work in which I was engaged. However, my first supervisor in Ottawa, a seasoned social worker from Wales, kept me honest, dwelling on theory and analysis, my dwelling on theory and analysis and wondering why people endured poverty. They were not enough. I had to know how to wipe a nose. So it was sort of like Marx meeting Maslow. The other message that was strongly imparted to me was that if I wanted to make a career of social work beyond youth work, I would have to get my MSW. DSWs were not in vogue in the mid-1960s. That's another story. So it was that I went to Vancouver and to UBC. And at the same time, 1972, the UBC school was fully accredited by the US Council on Social Work Education, although what was to become the Canadian Association of Schools of Social Work, which is now the Canadian Association of Social Work Education, was just about to assume that kind of mantle of taking on the task of accrediting Canadian schools. But it's interesting, just as an aside, that Canadian schools were accredited for some time by the CSWB. I believe that's. And UBC's curriculum, not unlike other schools, represented a rather bland blend of policy and practice. In the first year, we all followed the same curriculum. A course in research, a course in human behavior and development, an integrated practice course taught over the full academic year, covering community organization, group work, individual and family practice. A course in social policy, I think that was also a full year. Although I always remember because the lecturer never got beyond the first page of her notes. I always found that interesting. But anyway, that's an aside. There was no mission statement guiding the school, or any other school for that matter. There was simply, in retrospect at least, some sort of assumption about what social work was and what knowledge base was required. It was guided by a code of ethics that also embodied certain values. So while the aftermath of the 60s continued to play itself out, the central thread of the school was that there was a universal explanation for human and social behavior that could be determined through sound research. That liberal left-leaning social reform would bring a modicum of social equality, and that effective practice skills based on various psychological theories and an awareness of the client's social environment. Freud was still evident as filtered through Eric Erikson, and Carl Rogers was sort of beginning to make some impact, that sort of thing. Would best assist our clients in making their way in the world. Practice was affected by the policy context in which it occurred, but practice, or the knowledge that arose from practice, could also inform policy. Little, if any, attention was accorded to cultural issues, to diversity, race, sexuality, and so on. And despite the many problems that plagued British Columbia's First Nations, no attention was paid to them. Although the school had the occasional First Nation student, I remember there were 2 in my class, they simply followed the curriculum as existed as they represented a universal truth. At the time, there was a certain blindness at the school, at least as evidence to the students, as there was in other schools, to the history and condition of First Nations, to second wave feminism, to racism in British Columbia, and so on. I mean, British Columbia had already had an incredible history of racism with its Asian populations. So in retrospect, the school had evolved over time to embody some sort of mild reconciliation between the split in social work that had its origins in the differences between the charity organization society and the settlement house movement. These differences represent, I think, what David Howe has referred to as this distinction to be made in social work theory. That is, there is theory that informs the practice of social work, and there is theory that seeks to explain what is the purpose of social work. The one informs the other, and vice versa. Since my own social work education, there has been somewhat of an unraveling of this mild reconciliation, mainly because we have witnessed a collapse of what we thought were to be universal truths, and thus some idea of unity of purpose and of general practice standards. Social work today is in a muddle, in my opinion, but perhaps it's a healthy muddle. David Howe writes that when he reads accounts of what social workers did 60, 80, or even 100 years ago, he is struck by the similarity of situations encountered and of practice approaches to resolving the situations. That said, he also acknowledges how much ideas about practice have changed and been incorporated into how we understand and interpret the problems of everyday life. For as many social workers there are also a multitude of practice approaches, many of which blend different approaches or mix and match depending on how the situation presents itself and how the worker understands it. That in itself, he argues, means there is no single theoretical truth. That said, I think there is something about the nature of liberal capitalism that produces the particular forms of inequalities, especially poverty, that does demand a more consistent response. But just before I get to it, I'd like to put the muddle into some sort of perspective. So that is where we go back to the origins here. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between the charity organization society and the settlement house movement, because it's important in how it is informed, really, where we are still at today, I think. So I'm going to take you back to sort of the middle of the 19th century, like middle of the 1800s, and or the late the late 19th century, really, where there was really a lot of debate going on in Great Britain at the time over social reform, including you can trace them. Debates over whether the working classes should be educated. Whether there were pros and cons. If they were educated, they would know too much. They would get sort of want to rise above their station. But on the other hand, if they weren't educated, they wouldn't be able to read the sign like "Watch the slide when you go by," or "Be careful of the machinery in the coal mine," or something. Be that sort of. So central to this debate was the Romantic movement, which arose mainly in response to rationalism as the guiding principle of human endeavor. According to Samuel Mencher, writing back in 1967, Romanticism, quote, sought to replace the emphasis on rational self-interest, meaning that's the utilitarian pursuit of happiness, with the recognition of social obligations and responsibilities. A fundamental tenet of Romanticism was the expression or increase of the individual's own sense of self through concentration on the whole person rather than merely the economic rational person. The individual's own limits would be expanded to fulfillment. Romanticism had a profound effect on the expression of the liberal arts, theology, and science. It had a deep effect here in Canada as well. You can read about it. Ramsey Cook, historian at York University, wrote The Regenerations, in which he explores the foundations of the social gospel. So it reawakens spiritual, moral, and aesthetic values while minimizing libertarian and, ironically, egalitarian ones. There's a return to more fundamental thinking about the natural order of the classes and the moral obligations and duties of those with status towards those without it. It was, as Ashford points out, a distinctly elitist and university-educated movement which was able to provide sentiment and compassion for those who had suffered the worst effects of the Industrial Revolution, and in doing so, effectively minimized Marxist inroads. Romanticism's impact was twofold. First, it introduced the question of moral judgment and responsibility into the debates over social reform. And second, through its own internal schism or division, largely centered on issues of moral responsibility, it laid the groundwork for and gave expression to service delivery structures which even today reflect the different emphasis placed on individual and social responsibility for the plight of the poor. While there was a general consensus among the Romantics of the need for moral and spiritual regeneration, there were significant differences of opinion as to what that meant in their work with the poor of England's slums. The Charity Organization Society, COS, believed that individually, the poor suffered from moral degeneration, that their dependence on relief was largely a reflection of their degeneration, and that through the intervention of the Charity Organization Society workers, an individual could grow to become a person of moral worth and character. By accepting responsibility for her or his own situation in life, the individual could rise above the hardships imposed by personal moral turpitude, and through determination, resolve, and good character, achieve respectability and independence. For the COS, life is conceived, quote, as moral welfare. The life of the poor is an eternal struggle between dependence and independence, between worthiness and unworthiness. So not surprisingly, the COS strongly allied itself with laissez-faire capitalism. It was not the economic system per se that was wrong, but the society actors who had nurtured it. Social reform was to take the form of services which would regenerate the individual, build moral worthiness, and provide relief only to those who demonstrated resolve to better their circumstances. As for the upper classes, it was their duty not only to defend the rightness of the social order, but to inspire the poor to moral enlightenment and self-sufficiency. Mencher writes, quote, "For them, the present system of society was right. They did not consider the poor the victims of injustice, nor did they feel any sense of personal guilt for the state of the power, for the state of the lower classes. In fact, it was the charity movement and society that were righteous, and the poor were the malefactors." In contrast to the COS, the settlement house movement, while emphasizing moral character, viewed its development much less pejoratively. Indeed, the settlement house movement was more inclined to see the immorality of the poor as a consequence of their situation, rather than having acquired or authored it by virtue of personal fault. So there we see a very clear distinction. Whereas the COS saw their social work as a way of saving the poor from the sin of dependence. By the way, so actually George Bernard Shaw wrote Major Barbara, if you're familiar with that play, in this period. The settlement house followers ennobled the work as part of the total character and life of a person, although they were not necessarily drawn on Marx, because in some aspect people forget about Marx sometimes. He actually felt like work was an incredibly important activity to the total being of a person. So this was an important distinction from the COS. It removed work from the notion of being a necessary evil, which when equated with the individual was something to be bartered as a commodity, and placed it instead within the wholeness of the individual, to be seen as a source of pride and an extension of the self. If the total character of a person was to be developed, it was not enough to perceive that development as merely the escape from economic dependence, but as the total development of citizenship and participation. To this end, the settlement movement was concerned with the general improvement of the communities of the poor as it was with the individuals who lived in them. Those who associate with the settlement house movement were more likely followers of the Fabian Society, which was the sort of organization that was almost like a forerunner to the Labour Party. It was certainly informed aspects of the Labour Party. They ascribed to good social planning and believed in and promoted the state provision of housing, schools and education, libraries, parks, museums, baths, and sanitation. In addition, writes Mencher, the settlement movement identified with the collective efforts of the workers themselves to improve their own conditions. Trade unions, the abolition of casual work, and the improvement of skills were seen as a means by which the lower classes could redress the uneven balance of wealth in society, while at the same time increasing their own independence and initiative rather than depending on state benevolence. Although there was a general agreement among the Romantics about the moral disintegration of society, of the social order, and of the unconscionable abandonment of the poor by the upper classes, the settlement house movement most strongly asserted the social interdependence of the classes and the need for a rapprochement among all classes. The bringing together of the rich and poor as neighbors and the establishment of the, quote, brotherhood of man, class solidarity, the sense of fellowship or friendship were the most repeated goals of the settlement leader. It was an acknowledgement of common responsibility for the common good, which so clearly distinguished the settlement house movement from the charity organization society. The Romantic movement crystallized the differences in perception of the meaning of welfare and linked the idea of welfare to the provision of a service at the community level. By the beginning of the 20th century, welfare was beginning to be seen not simply as a state of well-being, but as a condition that could be attained by the provision of services. The scope of services provided by whom and under what conditions strongly reflected the political ideologies of the providers. Provision of services for the benefit of a person's welfare could be seen pejoratively and as a reflection upon the economic dependence and wanting moral standards of the recipient, or it could be seen positively as a reflection upon the goodwill and fellowship of society as a whole towards the betterment of all its members. From the pejorative perspective, provision of welfare services was always to be minimal and never to escape the idea of just relief. Positively, however, provision of services was to be optimal and increasingly universal. Pejorative view is held to greater and lesser degrees, mainly by the classical liberals and the Conservative Party, while the positive view was most closely associated with the radical liberals, the Fabians, and finally the Labour Party. So that sort of is my little summary of the impact of the Romantic movement on how we view welfare. So I'm now going to move to how this sort of move forward into more modern day social work. And in a sort of another debate that emerged in between the two schools of social work in Canada in the early 20th century, between the University of Toronto and McGill. And I'm drawing here largely on one of Cindy's colleagues, Ken Moffat, whose book, The Poetics of Social Work, a very important little book on some different, how social work was thought of, how social intervention was thought of in the early to mid 20th century of Canada. So really, I'm looking at idealism, science and technology, and do we have a profession or a social movement? So the differences between the charity organization society and the settlement house movement arguably set the stage for the formative debate about social work education and the purpose of social work. This debate in Canada was embodied in the directors of only two schools of social work in the early 20th century, those at McGill University and its director, Carl Dawson, who was there from 1922 to 1931, and at the University of Toronto, Edward Johns Urwick, who was there from 1928 to 1937. Urwick represented the idealist perspective to social work, Dawson the rigorously scientific. Dawson succeeded Howard Falk, who had founded social work education at McGill. And Falk was a Fabian socialist, an idealist, who believed that social workers should be trained not only, quote, in the methods of treating poverty, but in research and knowledge of other disciplines. Falk had caused somewhat of an uproar at McGill. I think it was around he was balking at the idea of accepting money from a lot of rich people in Montreal to support social work education. And he saw this, I think, as kind of dirty money, in a sense. And it caused quite an uproar at McGill and among Montreal's English elite. So when he resigned, the hiring committee very deliberately selected Dawson, who, although a graduate in divinity from the University of Chicago, actually had focused his doctoral studies on sociology. And Dawson firmly subscribed to the scientific method and conceived social work as an applied social science and social workers as social engineers. Social workers, first and foremost, needed to be good researchers because only through objective research could society, social problems, and their effect on individuals be understood. By maintaining a distance from their clients and their immediate circumstances, social workers could better understand the issues affecting them and could then, quote, engineer them to adjust and adapt to a society always and naturally in flux, unquote. Dawson thought that, quote, the social worker's primary task was the rehabilitation of families and disintegrated persons and the readjustment of social machinery. And he was very careful, just a readjustment, just a little tweaking of social machinery, as he referred to it, that contributed to crippling the weak. So here we see also a bit of a Darwinian perspective as well. He clearly refuted idealism. Social work, he thought, should detach itself from its religious, mission-oriented stance and adopt a specialized leadership role in society. It must abandon its value-based sentimental pretensions and become instead a specialized objective discipline. In contrast to Dawson, E.J. Urwick came to Canada in 1924 from Britain. He was, I won't say elderly, but 50. Funny move, obviously, yeah. He'd already had a distinguished career in social services and academia, having worked at Toynbee Hall, which was a very famous settlement house in London, and later director of both the London School of Sociology and Social Economics and the Department of Social Science and Administration at the London School of Economics. He also developed and taught social work for the charity organization Society in London. And in Toronto, he had come really to pursue, he wanted to write it, I reflect on his career and write about it, I think. So he had no intention of resuming an academic career, but soon found himself head of the University of Toronto's Department of Political Economy, and then director of the Department of Social Service. Urwick had a profound distrust of social science because he thought, quote, it excluded issues of conscience, free choice, will, and the ideals and purposes that give moral significance to behavior. Urwick thought that the trend within universities to surrender to science-based knowledge and reason would lead to the abandonment of moral philosophy and fundamental questions about what constituted a good society, a good end. Social progress could not be meaningful if no endpoint was understood to exist. Urwick thought that social work was becoming overly obsessed with method and casework technique. For example, by that period, I think people like Mary Richmond had written social diagnosis, sort of based on the medical model. And that it was based only on a narrow social science. Technique led social workers to practice, quote, without considering underlying principles. This is Urwick. And without understanding or engaging in questions of why they did what they did and to what end. Urwick saw social work as a collaborative, dialogical, reciprocal engagement of workers with their clients. True to his settlement house roots, Urwick embraced the idea of the fellowship of all human beings. This meant that the clients were to be equal allies with within social work tasks. Because what was important was a community of feeling and experience, fellowship and sympathy, the will to share. Social change would result from this kind of relationship, from the democratization of social work. The problem with scientific-based social work, according to Urwick, was that, quote, it led social workers to have fascistic tendencies and to be agents of social control because science, on which technique was based, produced what was accepted as irrefutable knowledge, irrefutable fact. Scientific knowledge informed society of what had to be done, and social workers were the foot soldiers to do it. So Urwick fought a losing battle. Social work was about giving in, about helping the individual overcome her or his difficulties and adapt to the social order. The moral turpitude that the COS saw as the obstacle for the client to overcome is translated by science into individual pathology that practice techniques based in science could help overcome. Social work could now safely move away from its religious roots and gain respect by becoming a profession. I've written elsewhere that today, Canadian social work remains entrenched in the scientific paradigm. Certainly elements of the idealist tradition are evident in both teaching and practice. Overwhelmingly, however, social workers are trained in conventional, clinical and quasi-clinical modes of intervention that claim the support of scientific theory and evidence and that focus on client adaptation or adjustment to society's prevailing liberal capitalist ideology and social structure. That's Millau. Social policy as an area of social work study is generally accorded less importance now than it had following the Second World War. Indeed, where once social work was influential in the formation of social policy, it is now primarily subject to it. Social workers are practitioners, not formulators. In short, while social change and social justice remain in the social work lexicon, what they actually mean can be fairly limited. Tinkering with existing systems to make them more efficient or responsive might be all social change means in many schools of social work. But changing the fundamental way in which society is organized is not always on the table. At any rate, social workers who are committed to meaningful, broad social and economic change are most often severely constrained by the conventional agencies that employ them and the government policies and regulations that govern them. No surprise there. The question possibly boils down to this: can social work be a profession and actively promote social change? Brian Moore did not think so. Those who know Brian, he died some time ago, but he was formerly director of the School of Social Work at UVic and dean of the Faculty of Human Development. If social work is a profession, Ward argued, it cannot be a social movement. I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But in fairness, many persons are drawn to social work precisely because they see social and economic injustice in the world around them and want to make a difference, often a profound difference, and want therefore to learn ways in which social change can occur. Am I doing okay with time? So I'm now going to move sort of into the third part of the diatribe here. I call this sort of troubles and issues, the nature of liberal capitalism, social and economic equality. So I want to turn both to the nature of liberal democracy and to the depth of its ideology. And I use that term somewhat in a Marxist sense of false consciousness. You know, the meaning of ideology, that ideology is not always something that you know, I might say that I believe in such and such and such and such, and that's a sort of a fairly conscious ideology that I have. But I was always, you know, I'm not a total Marxist, but what has partly always drawn me to Marx is that notion of false consciousness, that we sort of operate in a world in which we sort of accept the received ideas. We scarcely think of the way in which we live, you know, and yet, and there's a kind of false consciousness around that. I mean, how many of us go into a shopping mall and think about really the power behind that shopping mall? Usually, the people who control the property that mall is on and what they want you to do in there and so on. You know, I'd probably go crazy actually if I thought about it all. So one of the foremost analysts of liberal democracy who's always influenced me is a guy called C.D. McPherson, who was a political scientist at University of Toronto in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And McPherson reminds us of several features of liberal democracy that scarcely surface in our everyday consciousness. So accustomed are we to its everyday workings and culture. The first feature that McPherson notes, and that many people prefer not to hear, it's kind of few on this, is that liberal democracy and capitalism go together. Wherever we find liberal democracies, we find capitalism as the organizing economic system. Secondly, the liberal state, together with capitalism, came first. Democracy was a tag-on. We democratized after the liberal state itself was organized. And we democratized pretty recently at that, in the last 150 years. I think 150 years ago was what I used to say maybe 20 years ago. Forgive me. Third, like other state systems, liberal democracies are systems of power. They are organized around a fundamental set of principles which their governments enforce. That is, the government can A, make people do things they ordinarily would not do, and B, stop them from doing things they otherwise would. If we look at these features in turn, we can come to understand the underlying tensions that exist in liberal democratic societies. It is these tensions that social work is arguably always dealing with, and for which all social workers, in my view, should be educated. That's my little rant right here. And here is where we enter the world of structural social work. The liberal capitalist state emerged first and was developed on the principles of private property and the regulation of competition. The philosophies for which were first wholly enunciated by the likes of Hobbes and Locke, who, as McPherson's pointed out, did not really invent these ideas. They merely brought a rationale to justify what was already happening. This is the view of Britain. The liberal state was and is characterized by the free market and the idea of freedom of choice. As McPherson wrote, quote, instead of a society based on custom, on status, and on an authoritarian allocation of work and rewards, you had a society based on individual mobility, on contract, and on impersonal market allocation of work and rewards in response to individual choices. Indeed, as Rousseau wrote, individuals were compelled to be free. For the breakdown of feudalism and the emergence of the free market left no alternative other than seeking one's welfare in the market. The community gave way to individualism, or more specifically to possessive individualism, the notion of the sovereign self. Market society could only work best if there was a way to sort out competing interests. A non-arbitrary or responsible system of government was needed. The government thus was put in a sort of market situation in which it is expected not simply to provide law and order, but the particular kinds of laws and regulations and tax structures that would enable the system to function, including infrastructure, land grants for railways and canals, and so on. In other words, the liberal state was very much about supporting the interests of what McPherson referred to men of substance, the property and aristocratic classes. But in order to make the system work effectively and responsive to competing demands, for example, how do we decide on whether to grant land to Bob for his canal or Tom for his railway? It was decided that government power should be put into the hands of men who represented those competing interests. And this was done through the formation of the party system and having government subject to periodic elections. The electorate was small, consisted mainly of those men of substance, so the differences of opinion were narrow and highly interest-based. By the way, just as again as an aside, this is the English literature side of me coming in. There's a wonderful novel by George Eliot, called Middlemarch. And if you've ever seen the televised production of it too, there's a wonderful scene of one of these elections happening. And the working class people are all just sort of standing up. They can sort of yell and cheer and boo and hiss if they want, but they would have no vote in that. But the sort of, but it was sort of the debates between the sort of high-flying industrialists. So who was going to get elected to power in Westminster. So the electorate, as I said, the electorate was small. But for the freedom of choice to work properly, certain other freedoms were needed. Freedom of choice meaning, voting and so on. Certain other freedoms were needed, such as freedom of association and of assembly, freedom of speech and publication, and so on. And these freedoms were held to be universal. So by its own logic, they could not reasonably be denied to the laboring classes. She said, well, we need to be able to express our interests freely in the marketplace. And as we know, so they cannot be denied to the laboring classes, and as we know, not to women, who are shut out of this elite club. And I always sort of think of our liberal state as it's beginning sort of like an elite club, and only over time did some of us finally get admitted in, and women only very recently, really, if you think about it. So very gradually over time, and in response to the demands of working people that their interests were not served by the government of the liberal state, the franchise was extended to men from various classes. The lower end of the merchant class, the skilled craftsmen, manual laborers, and so on. So as McPherson notes, democracy came as a late addition to liberal society. However, and what is critical here, is that the market, capitalist society, by its own logic, can only succeed by producing inequalities of wealth. That is the nature of capitalism. There's no secret here. I mean, we're not hiding it. No matter how they try and dress it up. Capitalism doesn't work without inequalities of wealth. So however, as the liberal state democratized, it introduced a competing ethos. That is the equality of all people. Because that's the original meaning of democracy. It was about government by the masses, and that is what was feared by the ruling elites. So arguably, in liberal democracies, we have an irreconcilable tension, an ongoing tension all the time, between the forces that drive an economy that produces great inequalities of wealth and of class, versus the ethos of democracy that is a powerful force for greater equality. You can see that played out in our politics. 10 o'clock. I go a bit longer. I'm almost finished, believe it or not. I now turn to the compulsory transfer of power in liberal democracy. Much is said about freedom in our system, but just how free are we if we lack property and capital? First, it is important to remember again just how much emphasis we place on the individual and individual freedom and responsibility in our society, and that we owe to the rise of market society and the dissolution of custom-based prescribed societies. But have we not replaced one prescribed social order with another? Since our economic system, and hence our social system, are based on the organization of capital, it is the role of government to make and enforce those laws and regulations that sustain the essence of the system. And one of the key roles of our governments is to enforce the relationship between capital and labor. McPherson writes, quote, "The job of the liberal state is to protect and enforce the mechanism of free contract, and to ensure each the right to such property as he can acquire by his labor and by his contracts," unquote. If you think about the last Harper government and how they would always head off, I can remember several strikes that they would head off even before there'd been a strike already. They would just sort of kind of introduce legislation. Nope, that's not going to happen. So I think that was a pretty raw example of the government sort of flexing its muscles and saying, we're here to ensure that the conditions necessary for the operation of effective capitalism are going to continue. That's basically the message of it. So according to McPherson, the essential relationship, and this is a Marxist term, between people in a fully developed capitalist society is that most people have not got enough land or capital of their own to work on. You have to see land or capital in sort of an abstract sense to it. Capitalism would not be capitalism if is that most people have not got enough land or capital of their own to work on, and thus have to work on someone else's. Capitalism would not be capitalism if the already accumulated capital and the effective power to accumulate it was not in the hands of a relatively small number of individuals, therefore, or corporations. It is their decisions and their power to set people to work in ways they decide that make the wheels go round. This might be okay if, according to straight market logic, people were remunerated exactly the worth of their labor. And sometimes in relatively simple market exchanges, this might be the case. But in a capitalist market economy is more complex because in order to survive, capitalism must accumulate more than it invests or spends. It largely achieves this through its relationship with labor, or it is at labor's expense that capitalism produces and accumulates. Labor is never paid its true value or worth. So it's important now to distinguish, and this is where social work does actually really come in, between the capacity and ability to labor. The capacity to labor is the combined strengths and skills a person possesses, what she or he brings to the marketplace. The ability to labor is the ability a person actually has to the means of putting his capacities and skills to work. So a person's power must therefore include access to something to work on, access to the land or materials or other capital, without which her or his capacity to labor cannot become active labor, and so cannot produce or do anything to her or his purpose. Thus, a person's power must include access to the means of labor. If a person has no capacity to labor, her or his power is reduced to zero in the liberal state. If you don't have any capacity to labor, you you got nothing to offer the labor market. So you have to rely then on sustenance from outside the competitive market, meaning charity or state welfare. If a person has no ability to labor, so no access to the means of production, even though her or his capacity to labor is intact, then similarly her or his power is reduced to zero and must similarly rely on sustenance outside the marketplace. And we are all familiar with our welfare systems that respond to both these situations, and the differential conditions placed on those with no capacity to labor, usually thought of as more deserving, versus those with no ability. We all know how single employable people are often treated in the welfare system. If they can't get work, then they are always being encouraged to be out there pounding the pavement looking for work, right? That's but if a person does have access to the means of production but cannot, if a person has access to the means of production but cannot get it for nothing, then her or his powers are reduced by the amount of them that he has to hand over to get the necessary access. Okay, well, this is exactly the situation most people are in the capitalist market society. What McPherson means here is that in obtaining employment in the capitalist market society, most of us give up some power. We in effect transfer power to the person who holds the means of access to labor. That person sets the conditions and sets the price of labor. Yes, in the modern state, we can bargain if we have a union, or with exceptional skills, we might be able to gain a concession or a higher price for our labor than the employer might otherwise want. But in the main, those who control access to labor set the conditions of that labor irrespective of what a person might need or want. In this sense, there is an ongoing net transfer of power in liberal society, a net transfer which is supported and enforced by the state, and which in effect is compulsory. Unless you are independently wealthy, you either throw yourself on the mercy of the state, and that is precisely what happens to persons who have no capacity to labor, or you seek your welfare in the marketplace and give up some of your power in doing so. You are in effect dependent, although ideologically we love to call those who work as independent. No matter how you look at it, in order to get access to the means of labor, a person loses absolute freedom of choice and must accept a wage which is necessarily worth less than the real value of her or his labor. So, I'm just about finished here. Inasmuch as the liberal democratic state is the capitalist market state, then it can be said that the liberal democratic state is the agent that ensures the unequal transfer of power between individuals and groups in our society. And inasmuch as liberal democracy is the liberal state with the democratic franchise tacked on as an afterthought, then we can safely say that liberal democracies are very much about enforcing unequal relations of power. It is this inherent structure of our society that, despite its many freedoms and benefits, will continually reproduce inequality, and indeed reproduce it with increasingly alarming disparities of wealth and reach, even beyond state-defined borders. Social work, as Ken Collier once remarked, is left to mop up, and dare I say, manage these inequalities which find expression through various marginalized groups, abandoned either to no capacity to labor or to the worst forms of oppression experienced at the lower ends of the access to the means of labor. McDonald's, those various places. The market society was built on liberal ideology and on the liberal ideal of the free individual, free to pursue his or her own welfare in the marketplace, free to acquire and own property, free to develop and improve her property, and most importantly, responsibly for her own welfare. Here I am always drawn to C. Wright Mills, who in his book, Sociological Imagination, raises the question of troubles and issues. Without referring to him directly, his argument, as I recall it, is this. If in a city of 100,000 persons, one person is unemployed, then perhaps that person has a personal trouble. But if in that same city, 10,000 persons are unemployed, then we would say there is a public issue. But, Mills argues, rather than treat it as a public issue, it is often still ascribed to a personal fault or failure. That is how ideology works. And often as social workers, we would have caseloads of unemployed individuals where our job would be to ensure they are out pounding the pavement, looking for work anywhere. And this, I might say, is the taking off point for structural social. I think I'll leave it there. I could go on. I could fill in after the I think I'll leave it there. I'm happy to talk to Indigenous issues in terms of how that ideology is played out with Indigenous people. But, maybe that can come out in the discussion.